Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The holographic results shimmered before Elias Porter's eyes, and for the first time in his political career, the numbers didn't go his way. He had lost. The quiet gasps of his campaign staff echoed through the room, the shock palpable. In the center of the screen, the face of Victor Kane appeared, smiling, exuding an air of triumph. The man Elias had hoped to defeat and believed he had to defeat for the sake of society was now the elected leader. Elias stood rigid, his fists clenched behind his back as he watched Kane begin his victory speech. The words were hollow, filled with promises Elias knew Kane had no plan of keeping. But the people had spoken, and Kane's charisma, his show of strength, had won them over. Elias had campaigned on a platform of careful, thoughtful governance, but it seemed Kane's boldness and willingness to exploit fear had tipped the scales. Elias, a broken bar of voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see Amara, a close advisor and old friend, her dark eyes heavy with the weight of the moment. "I know," Elias said quietly, forcing a smile. "We move forward. It's what the people want." But deep down, it didn't feel right. Kane wasn't just another politician, he was reckless, impulsive, a man who saw power as a means of personal gain rather than public service. Elias had long warned his supporters that Kane's leadership would end in disaster, but now, watching the results solidify, he could already see the future unraveling before him. Elias left the campaign headquarters shortly after Kane's speech ended, brushing off condolences from his supporters. The city streets were unusually quiet, and the ever-present hum of drones scanning the skyline added to the eerie silence. Elias entered his private office, its walls lined with historical records and artifacts from a world that had once been simpler. It was here, among the relics of the past, that Elias felt grounded. As he poured himself a glass of water, his wrist communicator vibrated. The small screen lit up with Amara's name. "Elias, we need to talk." Elias sighed and tapped the device. "Come in," he said, knowing she was probably already on her way. Sure enough, within minutes, the door slid open, and Amara stepped inside. "I thought you might need this." She held out a small data chip, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. Elias raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "An offer." He took the chip from her hand, eyeing it warily. "I'm not in the mood for riddles tonight, Amara." "I know. That's why I'm being direct." Amara leaned against his desk, her expression serious. "This is from the Time Council." Elias stiffened. The Time Council was a name whispered in quarters of power, rarely spoken aloud. The elite group controlled the most coveted technology in the world at time manipulation. It was rumored that only a handful of people in the world even had access to their resources, and fewer still dared to use them. Elias shook his head. "Amara, you can't be serious. You know how I feel about this." "Listen to me, Elias," Amara urged, stepping closer. "They've authorized it. A chance to go back and change the result of the election. You wouldn't need to shift much, just influence a few key moments in the campaign. The world doesn't have to end up under Kane's control." The room seemed to shrink as Elias stared at her, processing her words. A chance to change everything. To stop Kane before he even took power. The temptation was there, pulling at him, tugging at his sense of duty. But with it came a deep sense of unease. Time manipulation was a power no human should wield lightly, and to use it for personal gain, that went against everything Elias had built his career on. "No," Elias said firmly. "I won't do it." Amara blinked, taken aback. "Elias, think about what's at stake. This isn't just about you. This is about the future of the entire society." "Do you really trust Kane with that kind of power?" "It's not my place to decide the future," Elias replied, setting the chip down on his desk. "The people made their choice, and I have to respect that." Amara's eyes softened, but her expression remained resolute. "And when Kane's decisions start tearing everything apart, will you be able to live with yourself, knowing you had the power to stop it?" "I'll have to," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned away from her, gazing out the window at the city below. The skyline shimmered with the neon glow of a future that now seemed uncertain. Amara was silent for a long moment before she finally spoke again. "You're a good man, Elias." "Too good, sometimes." She walked toward the door, pausing before it slid open. "But I'll keep the chip for you, just in case." The door hissed shut behind her, leaving Elias alone with his thoughts. The temptation still lingered, but deep down, he knew he had made the right decision. He couldn't betray the integrity of time, no matter how much it hurt to see his opponent take the reins of power. Weeks passed, and the transition to Kane's leadership began. At first, the changes were subtly new appointments, small shifts in policy. But soon, Elias began to see the cracks forming. Kane's administration was disorganized, his advisors inexperienced. Kane had always been more of a showman than a leader, and now that he was in power, it was becoming painfully clear. Reports of unrest began to surface. Kane's economic reforms, designed to boost the wealthy elite, were leaving the lower classes in a state of desperation. Crime rates spiked, protests erupted in several major cities, and talk of rebellion began to circulate. Elias watched it all unfold from the sidelines, his heart heavy. He had warned people that this would happen, but no one had listened. Now, as society teetered on the brink of collapse, he wondered if there was anything he could do. One evening, as Elias reviewed the latest reports of unrest, his wrist communicator buzzed again. It was Amara. "We need to talk," she said, her tone urgent. Elias met her at a small, nondescript cafe copyright on the edge of the city. It was late, and the place was nearly empty. Amara sat at a corner table, her expression grim. "I assume you've seen the news," she said as Elias sat down. "I have," Elias replied. "Things are worse than I thought." "They're going to get a lot worse," Amara said, her voice low. "Kane is planning to escalate. He's already in talks with the military to begin deploying drones to control the protests." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. "That's madness. He's going to start a war." "Exactly," Amara said, leaning forward. "This is what I was warning you about. Kane's decisions are going to lead to disaster. You need to intervene, Elias." Elias stared at her, his mind racing. "You're saying I should use the time manipulation tech?" Amara hesitated, then shook her head. I know you won't." "But there's another way." Elias raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" "You can influence Kane without altering time," Amara said. "You know him better than anyone. You've debated him, studied his policies, his personality. You can guide him as subtly, behind the scenes, help him make the right decisions." Elias leaned back in his chair, considering her words. The idea seemed far-fetched, almost impossible. Could he really change the course of events without directly interfering? "I don't know, Amara," he said slowly. "Even if I could influence him, what makes you think he'll listen?" "He doesn't have to know it's you," Amara replied. "You can work through intermediaries, advisors, the media. Plant ideas in his administration, make him believe they're his own. You've got the political know-how, you just have to be willing to use it." Elias remained silent, weighing the options. He had vowed not to manipulate time, but this was something different. It wasn't about changing the past, it was about shaping the future, guiding it in the right direction without violating his principles. "All right," he said finally. "I'll try." Amara smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "Good. But be careful, Elias. The Time Council is watching, and they won't like you interfering, even indirectly." Elias nodded, but inside, a new resolve had formed. He couldn't sit by and watch Kane destroy everything. If there was a way to avert disaster without compromising his beliefs, he would find it. Elias wasted no time. As soon as he left the cafe copyright, he began working to enact the plan. The first step was subtly reaching out to a few key contacts who had remained loyal to him even after the election. These were people inside Kane's administration, Those who still believed in the principles Elias had stood for but couldn't openly defy their new leader. The next few weeks were a delicate dance. Elias carefully planted ideas through third parties, ensuring they reached Kane without arousing suspicion. An offhand remark at a fundraiser, a well-placed article in a popular media outlet, and quiet suggestions during meetings are all methods Elias used to nudge the administration in a more responsible direction. At first, it was small victories. Kane, eager to bolster his public image, began to ease off his harsh economic policies, implementing reforms that Elias had long championed. The protests, though still present, began to diminish in size. The chaos subsided, if only a little. But Elias knew it wouldn't be enough. The larger issues of the looming military conflicts, the internal corruption were still festering beneath the surface. And as much as he tried to guide Kane's hand, he couldn't be everywhere at once. Then came the military escalation. Despite Elias's best efforts, Kane moved forward with his plan to deploy drones to quell the remaining protests. Elias had feared this moment, knowing it could spark a full-scale uprising. He needed to act fast. One evening, while reviewing the latest developments, Elias received a message from a high-ranking military officer who had been a silent ally. The message was simple: "They're moving in at dawn." Elias's heart pounded in his chest. He had no time. He couldn't influence Kane directly anymore, not with the situation spiraling out of control. The only option left was to confront the man himself. That night, Elias made his way to the capital, bypassing the usual protocols. His old connections allowed him discreet access to the building. As he reached the upper levels, where Kane's office was located, he steeled himself for the conversation to come. Kane was sitting behind his large desk, poring over reports. He barely looked up when Elias entered, a scowl already forming on his face. "Elias," Kane said, his voice cold, "I thought you learned your place after the election." Elias ignored the jab and stepped forward. "I'm not here to debate. I'm here because you're about to make a mistake that will cost thousands of lives." Kane leaned back in his chair, a smirk forming. "Is that so? And what mistake would that be?" "The drones," Elias said bluntly. "If you deploy them against your own citizens, you'll start a war. You won't be able to control it. You'll lose everything." Kane's expression hardened. "You think I don't know how to handle unrest? I was elected to bring order, Elias. The people demand security. The people demand stability." Elias shot back. "And what you're about to do will create the exact opposite. These protests are driven by desperation, not malice. If you deploy the drones, you'll push them over the edge. They'll fight back, and the blood will be on your hands." Kane stood up, pacing behind his desk. "You always did underestimate me, Porter. You don't see the bigger picture. This is about showing strength. A leader can't afford to look weak." "There's a difference between strength and recklessness," Elias said. "You have the power to lead this society in the right direction, but only if you make the right decisions. This isn't about looking strong, it's about being strong enough to do what's best for the people." For a moment, Kane said nothing, his eyes narrowing as he studied Elias. Then, with a wave of his hand, he dismissed the reports on his desk. "You know, I could have had you arrested for breaking in here. But I won't, because as much as I hate to admit it, you've got a point." Elias's pulse quickened. "Then call off the drones. Find another way." Kane walked over to the window, staring out at the city below. The silence stretched between them, heavy with tension. "I'll consider it," Kane finally said, his tone softer. "But this isn't over, Elias. I won't let this society fall apart under my watch." Elias nodded, knowing it was the best outcome he could hope for in that moment. "That's all I ask." He left the capital without another word, the weight of uncertainty still hanging over him. Would Kane really change his mind? Or was this just a temporary delay in the inevitable escalation? Elias couldn't be sure. The next morning, Elias woke to the sound of news reports flooding his communicator. Kane had called off the drone deployment. Instead, He announced a series of emergency relief measures aimed at addressing the root causes of the protests of poverty, inequality, and corruption. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. For the first time in weeks, Elias felt a glimmer of hope. But the victory was short-lived. That afternoon, Amara appeared at his doorstep, her expression tense. "We need to talk." Elias let her in, already sensing the bad news she carried. "The Time Council knows what you've been doing," Amara said without preamble. "They don't like it." Elias frowned. "I haven't touched the timeline. I've respected their rules." "They don't care," Amara said, pacing the room. "They see your influence as a threat. They think you're trying to circumvent their control over the future." "That's ridiculous," Elias said, frustration creeping into his voice. "I've been doing everything in my power to avoid changing the past. I'm just trying to prevent Kane from destroying everything." Amara stopped pacing and looked at him, her expression grave. "You know as well as I do that the Time Council doesn't see things that way. To them, the future is just as sacred as the past. They want total control, and you're undermining that." Elias sat down, rubbing his temples. "What are they planning?" "I don't know," Amara said, her voice softening. "But they're not going to sit back and let you keep interfering. You need to be careful, Elias. They'll come after you if they think you're a threat." Elias stood up, a newfound determination coursing through him. "Then let them come. I won't stop doing what's right, Amara. I've worked too hard to save this society from Kane's worst instincts. If the Time Council wants to stop me, they'll have to face me head on." Amara looked at him with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Just a broken bar. Be smart about it. You can't take on the Time Council alone." "I won't be alone," Elias said. "Not if I have you." Amara smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You'll always have me, Elias." "But we have to be careful." The following weeks were a game of cat and mouse. The Time Council's influence began to creep into Elias's life, subtle at first, the rumors spreading about him, allies suddenly turning cold, financial backing mysteriously drying up. But Elias pressed on, determined to guide Kane's administration toward stability and reform. Kane, for his part, continued to respond to Elias's covert influence, though he was unaware of the source. Slowly, the administration began to stabilize. Kane's more destructive tendencies were curbed, and his policies shifted toward a more balanced approach. But the Time Council wasn't finished. One night, as Elias worked late in his office, a strange sound echoed through the room. It was faint at first, like the hum of machinery, but it grew louder, more insistent. Elias stood, his eyes scanning the room. The sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Before he could react, the air around him shimmered, and a figure appeared in the center of the room, a man dressed in the formal, severe uniform of the Time Council. "Elias Porter," the man said, his voice cold and mechanical. "You've overstepped your bounds." Elias remained calm, though his heart raced. "I haven't violated any rules. I've respected the integrity of time." The man's eyes narrowed. "You've manipulated events. You've altered the course of history without touching the timeline directly, but the effect is the same. The Time Council cannot allow this to continue." Elias took a step forward, his voice firm. "I'm trying to prevent a disaster. Kane's leadership will destroy this society if he isn't guided properly. I'm not changing time, I'm protecting the future." The man's expression didn't change. "You don't have the authority to make that decision." Elias's eyes hardened. "Then who does?" "The Time Council, a group of people who sit in the shadows, pulling the strings of history." "I won't let you control the future just because you think you know best." The man's eyes gleamed, and for the first time, a hint of emotion flickered across his fascia. Anger. "You underestimate the power of the council, Porter. We shape the course of history because we understand its consequences. You're a politician, not a master of time." Elias stood tall, unflinching. "Maybe. But I know what's right. And I won't stop until this society is on the path to survival." The man took a step back, the shimmer around him growing brighter. "Then you leave us no choice." And with that, the figure disappeared, leaving Elias alone in the silent room. He knew the Time Council would be back. He knew they wouldn't stop until they regained control over the future. But Elias also knew that he couldn't stop fighting. Not now. Not when the stakes were higher than ever. He wasn't just fighting for the present anymore. He was fighting for the future. A future where people like Cain could be guided to make the right choices, where the integrity of time was respected, but not at the cost of human freedom. Elias Porter would be ready when they came for him again, and he wouldn't back down.